Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the November story in our storytelling calendar. You see the picture here, beautiful picture designed by our wonderful designer, Sarah. Um, Three lemons. Today, we're in a new part of the garden surrounding MARC printers. This is a linear garden between a warehouse and a railway line. So I may pause slightly if a train goes past. Three lemons. Okay. There were three brothers, and their parents died, one after the other, without a pause. And they had no real money, they had no trade, they'd been relying on their parents for year after year after year. And so they decided that they would have to leave this hovel that they lived in and go and find some employment. And the best place to go was to the castle where the king lived. And two of them set off, but the youngest one, who was known as Mike by the stove, because that's where he spent most of his time sitting with the warmth, thinking, he stayed behind for a moment. But by the time the two older brothers had reached the castle gates, he'd caught up with them. And they knocked, and they went in, and they were shown immediately to the king, because the king was interested any time some young, fit men came to the castle looking for employment. And in truth, there wasn't much to do. There wasn't really a job for them, but you could always find work, whether it was knocking nails into walls and then in the afternoon taking the nails out, or whether it was carrying wood, moving furniture. You could always find something for them to do. And they settled in, and it soon became clear that Mike by the stove was the best at knocking in nails and the quickest at taking nails out in the afternoon. He was also best at carrying timber and moving furniture, and soon his two brothers grew jealous. And so they got together and they plotted. And they found all the gossips within the staff, all the people who were best to spread a rumor. And they told them that Mike by the stove knew the location of the most beautiful princess in 12 kingdoms, and that he could bring her to the king. For the king had lost his first wife, which was careless, and he was looking for a new one. And so the king summoned Mike by the stove and said, I hear that you know this princess who's the most beautiful in the 12 kingdoms. Bring her to me. And Mike said, I know nothing of this, but that seems to anger you, so I will go and do my best to find this princess for you. And with that, he left the castle, and he chose a direction, and he began to walk. And he walked and he walked and he walked along a long, dusty road until he became thirsty and hungry. So he sat down by that path, and he took out some bread and some cheese and some ale. And he was just about to start when an old woman approached him. And she asked him who he was and what he was doing and where he was going. And after a chat, he said to her, if you're hungry, sit down with me, share my meal. Here, have some ale. And they sat and they ate, and everything was fine. And the old woman said, right, good luck on your journey. I hope you find something to help you in your quest. And they parted ways. And Mike by the stove carried on along that long, long, dusty road. But he'd not gone more than, 50 yards, when he found in front of him, in the middle of the road, a whistle. And he thought, oh, brilliant. And he picked it up, and it was one of those whistles with 3 holes, so you could use your fingers to make a tune. And as he walked, he practiced and practiced till he could play a tune on this whistle. And he came to the edge of woodland, and he walked into the trees whistling along, and almost immediately he was surrounded by dwarves. And the dwarf said, "Master, how can we help? Master, what do you need doing? Master, what can we do?" And Mike by the stove didn't realize he was a master, but he wasn't going to turn down an opportunity like this. And so he said, "My new friends, will you find the most beautiful princess in the 12 kingdoms and bring her to me?" And the dwarves chatted amongst themselves, and then they said, "No, we can't do that. It's not within our powers to bring somebody to you. But we know where the princess is, and we can take you to her, if that would help." And Mike by the stove agreed, and they set off as a troop, and they travelled and travelled along a long dusty road. This was a different road, until they reached a palace. And the dwarf said, "We have to leave you here, but if you go to that palace, you will find the most beautiful princess in the entire 12 kingdoms." And so that's what he did. And as he approached, he saw that the front doors were open. He walked in. Didn't seem to be anybody around. And he wandered and wandered until he came to a room. And in that room were 3 beautiful women. But as soon as they saw him, they started to panic, and they ran around like headless chickens, bumping into each other, bumping into the furniture. And then they disappeared. And Mike looked, and he saw that there was a door at the back of the room that led out of the palace. And he thought they must have gone that way, although I didn't see them leave. And then he looked down, and on the table in front of him were 3 lemons. And he thought, they might come in useful. I know lemons are sour, but if I get a thirst, at least I'll have some liquid to quench it. And he picked up those 3 lemons and he put them in his pockets. And then he went back through that other door onto a new path. And he walked and he walked and he walked and he walked until the sun came down upon him, and the heat was intolerable. And his thirst was great. And he remembered the lemons until he took a lemon out of his pocket. And with a knife, he sliced off the very top. And he was just about to drink from it when he looked inside. And inside the lemon was a princess, a beautiful princess. And she looked up out of the lemon. She said, "Help me, help me. I must have water. You must pour water onto the lemon, or I will die." And he looked on the dusty path. And he looked at the barren fields, and he picked up stones to see if there was any moisture underneath them. There was nothing. And when he'd searched as far as he could, he looked at the lemon, and the lemon had gone black, and the princess was dead. And he thought, "Oh, no matter what the temptation, I mustn't touch one of the other lemons. This is intolerable." But as he walked, the sun got hotter and hotter. And he was becoming almost delirious with the need for moisture. Without really thinking what he was doing, he took another lemon out of his pocket. With his knife, he sliced the top off, and then to his horror, he looked down, and yes, there was another beautiful princess. And she said to him, "Water, water, you must give me water. Pour it on the lemon, or I will die." And he looked around, he looked under stones, he looked behind bushes. Nowhere was there any water. And when he looked down, the lemon was black, and the second princess was dead. And you know, if you set off walking in a straight line, eventually you will circle round and you will come back to where you started from. And this was what was happening to Mike by the stove. And soon he was approaching the castle where the king was, from where he started. And now he was totally delirious. Didn't have a thought in his head apart from water. He knew he was going to die. And so, despite everything, he thought, I must try that last lemon. He took the third lemon out of his pocket. He sliced off the top. And there was the most beautiful princess. The other two had been pretty, but this princess in the lemon was stunning. But she said, I need water. If I don't have water, I will die. And at that moment, he was so near that castle that the miller was walking along that same path. And when he saw Mike by the stove, and he saw how parched he was, he saw how ashen he was, he saw how dehydrated he was, he picked him up and carried him in his arms to the mill pond and sat him in the water. And the first thing that Mike by the stove did was pour water onto that lemon before he sank down and drank and drank and drank. And when he looked up, the lemon was no more. Instead, there was a beautiful princess, stunning. But of course, you can't wear clothes in a lemon. That would just be ridiculous. And so she was naked. And Mike said, right, climb up into that tree right by the mill pond side. And I will go and tell the king everything that's happened. And I will get him or his servants to bring you clothes, and then you can go to the castle. And he wandered off and he went and he told the king everything that had happened. And the king could hardly contain himself with his desire to meet the most beautiful princess in 12 kingdoms. But while the story was being told and while he was preparing clothes for her, the cook, she came out of the castle to the mill pond to fetch water. When she got to the mill pond, she looked down and there reflected was a beautiful face. And she thought, I'd forgotten how beautiful I was. And she threw away the pail and said, collecting water is beneath me. And she danced and she sang, and then she looked back in the mill pond, and there were two faces, her face and the beautiful face of a woman, a naked woman in the tree. This angered the cook because she felt something had been taken away from her. And so she dragged that woman down out of the tree and threw her into the mill pond, and she disappeared. And so the cook stripped off all her clothes and climbed into the tree and awaited what might happen. So when the king arrived with the clothes and looked up into the tree, he saw a naked woman. And he thought, she's plainer than I thought she would be. And she's a bit flabby. And she's a bit older than I was expecting. But still, if the dwarves said she was the most beautiful princess in 12 kingdoms, and Mike by the stove attested to her beauty, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm looking at her wrongly. And maybe if she had a wash, and maybe if she was clothed in brilliant clothing and some jewellery, she might reveal her beauty to me. And so he took her down from the tree, took her back to the castle. The wig maker was brought. She was given the finest clothes. She was given jewellery to wear. And the king looked at her and thought, oh, she still looks frumpy to me. But he thought that she may grow into her beauty. And so he said, I cannot marry you now. I need to get to know you first. So let's have a period when we get to know each other. From that moment on, the cook, who is now the fiancé, was very rarely away from his side. Meanwhile, the new cook took a new bucket to the mill pond, swept it to fill it with water, and when she looked in, there was a big silver fish in her bucket. And she thought the king will want to see this. And so she took the fish to the king, and the king said, well, that's remarkable. Maybe we should eat it. But his fiancée said, no, this is witchcraft. Because she immediately saw what it in fact was. And said we should burn it. And so a fire was set, and the silvery fish was burnt. And when the flames died down, all that was left was a silver ingot, a big one. And the king said, oh, brilliant, I'll take that, put it with my other treasures. And his fiancée said, no, it's more witchcraft. We must bury it out of sight. And there was a manure heap, a compost heap, just over there. And so she insisted that it was dug into and the silver ingot placed underneath and then covered. The next morning, when they got up, there was the compost heap. But out through the middle of the compost heap into the sky was a linden tree with silver leaves and silver trunk. And the king said, well, that's amazing, isn't it? Because it wasn't there yesterday. And his fiancée shouted, witchcraft, witchcraft, it must be cut down. So the king sent 3 maids to cut down the tree. And once they cut it down, they chopped it into sections and made it into kindling. And they gave it to one of the maids to carry. She took it back towards the castle. But as she walked, she complained that it was getting heavier and heavier. And she looked down, and it was no longer silver wood kindling. It was no longer silver wood kindling. It was a baby girl. And she put the baby girl on the ground and watched as it grew and grew into a young child, and then an old child, and then to a beautiful young woman, the most beautiful woman that they'd ever seen. And they knew the king would be interested in this. But of course, the princess was naked. But this time, the 3 maids took her into the castle and dressed her before taking her to the king. And when the king saw her, love at first sight doesn't even cover it. She was beautiful. She was the beautiful princess that he'd imagined in every way. And she started to tell him the story of how she'd been naked in a tree, and then was a silver fish, and then a gold ingot, and then a tree, and then kindling, and finally, here she was. And all the time, his fiancée was trying to interrupt and say it was witchcraft. And he shouldn't listen to a word she said, but he was just besotted. And when he'd heard the whole story, he turned to his fiancée and said, right, I've heard the story. I know what happened. You will be punished. Punished he was. And the king immediately proposed to the beautiful princess. And within a short time, they were married. And there was a feast, and there were jugglers and tumblers and food and drink. It was a magnificent occasion. And they lived happily for a while after that. Thank you for listening to my story. And don't forget to tune in December for the last story of the calendar told by the wonderful Iris. Thanks.